This goes along with talking about some of the analysis that's done on social media. And it always looks cool. I actually started wondering one time, 20 years ago I was drawing these arrows and stuff and resultants and saying, look, here's, as best I can tell today, here's what appears to be going on in this exercise. And of course it's always oversimplified, and sometimes it needs to be because you're showing a specific thing. But nobody cared. Everybody was like, that didn't have anything to do with it. And certainly there's still a lot of people out there who don't see value in it. And certainly it's contextual. Is the goal to analyze it to get better at analyzing it, or is the goal to look at the exercise to get better at teaching it? Those are very different things. Whether this is applicable or not depends upon why you're looking at it. Where I'm going with this is, all over the social media world now are examples of people attempting to draw little arrows on static images of exercises. And I got to tell you, like I've seen them all? No. The vast majority that I've seen are either marginally or completely incorrect. And most people, it appears to me that most people watching it, and most people is a dumb thing to say, most people that come up to me and say, what do you think about this? I hate the statement, the question, what do you think about this? From a student, the first thing I say is, I don't think about it at all. I don't care. So many times when someone says, what do you think about this? It seems that they're saying, from their point of view, I don't know what to do with this. Tell me what to think. You know what I mean? And I guess probably I've done that somewhere in the past, but you don't need someone to fill your brain with what they think. What you need is a teacher to tell you, here's some things. What person asking the question, what do you see in this? Let's make a bullet point list of things you think you see. And then I'll try to help you maybe identify some things. If I can see any more things that should go on your bullet point list, we'll try to identify some more. And then we're going to need a context from which to pretend to evaluate it. And that's just for today. Hopefully we're smarter or can see more tomorrow. Or if someone says, is that reasonable for this individual? Give me a person. Because I got to tell you, my 99.5-year-old client, I don't care. In so many of the things that I have him do, I would never draw the forces. It's all about tolerance. It's all about his motor learning capabilities. The forces he's generating and the forces I'm putting on him, while important, are so sub-maximal. Right? I mean, you imagine doing a 1-rep max on a 100-year-old guy. Oh my God, NSCA, wake up. So here's the deal. There's a neat thing out there that people are doing. It's interesting how they said this. I would never say it this way. Vertical and horizontal forces. And it's actually cool that someone is recognizing in specific situations that there's more than gravity. That there's more than gravity. And you have to recognize this in order to begin even the most remedial analysis of an exercise. And the specific exercises are anything where your hands are restrained or your feet are restrained. And you're going, what is that? Is that like bondage? It's exercise bondage. It's you grabbing a bar. It's that simple. The choice of where you put your hands on the bar, that kind of thing. And some people say, well, I only use dumbbells. Okay, that's fine. Do you ever do a push-up? If someone does body weight and you do a pull-up or a push-up, what do you think that bar is providing? It's not just gravity. An exercise where your hands or feet are attached to something, it's not just gravity. It is never that simple. Okay? So the reality is, I would never call it vertical and horizontal forces because depending upon, that's a very specific tool you're using. If it's truly vertical, certainly gravity is hopefully vertical. The horizontal may or may not be true. Some of that has influences that we get to control and sometimes not. This is, to me, a more accurate way to represent it because anytime you have two forces applied to one object, come on, students of RTS and stuff, what is it called? Two forces applied to one object at the same point, because applied to one object could make it rotate also. So all you guys that try to steal the stuff I'm saying, you need to keep that in mind. Put that into your, if you can remember that, put that in there. Restraint, resultant. The big question is, which forces are you talking about? Vertical and horizontal forces? Well, Tom, they're talking about the vertical and horizontal. The vertical and horizontal of your effort, or the vertical and horizontal of the resistance? Not the same thing, in fact, exact opposites. So, which forces are they talking about? This is one of the things I found on the internet, and I was proud of them for even showing this. I've got another little video where we talk about the importance of this viewpoint, this superior or head-oriented, head-down viewpoint. Over here they talk about only vertical forces, and they draw a moment arm to a shoulder, which is actually back on a scapula. There's probably a shoulder joint up in here, but we'll forgive them that. And over here it says accounting for horizontal. And they've got not only vertical forces going up, which should tell you which ones they're considering, but they've got horizontal forces going out. Well, if it's up, it's likely not gravity. Agreed? And here's why this is. There are a couple things interesting about this. They draw a resultant of, well, really this is a resultant of this person's attempted shove. And in all honesty, while that's probably valid, this line of force and its moment arm to the shoulder would likely be better served if we were looking at the resultant of resistance. So if we were to play that game, because it tells us more, there's also some other things missing. For example, I don't know why they're not remotely interested in the moment arm to the elbow. That would be interesting. Now, what you would learn from that over here is that in this scenario, if there are only vertical forces, and this is going to flip some people out, you would only be using elbow flexors because the resistance is on the other side. So it would have to be elbow flexors participating in this thing, and you're going, no, you can't do a press, Tom, without triceps. And I'm going to say, you're wrong, because that's the way the physics goes. Sorry. And you can measure it with EMG and all that stuff if you want to. That's fine. But that's why one of the reasons we know this is highly unlikely in a bench press. No matter how you look at it, the relationship between effort forces and resistance forces is immediate and constant, and I hate this term, reaction forces. Reaction immediately implies one thing came first and something came second. These forces, if there are in fact two sets of opposing forces, and physics tells us there are, doesn't mean equal and opposite. If they were equal, nothing would move. Net forces, right? So they're not reactions. Reactions imply a time delay. This is immediate. A ground reaction force is, oh yeah, the ground's sitting around waiting for something to happen, and we put our fat foot down and the ground goes, I'm going to react to that. Come on! It's not a reaction force, guys. Exercise world might want to grow up when it comes to this stuff. Anyway, so yeah, let's look at it from another point of view. This is an example of an article that was in a journal that the exercise world respects, but the research world considers it like in the quality of research to be like, I don't know where Oscar the Grouch lives, if you ever watched Sesame Street, if you had kids. So vertical and lateral forces applied to the bar during bench press in novice lifters. Now, I respect the crap out of any version of exercise research that comes along and says in relatively specific groups. Because if someone says we did bench press with 100 people, if those were 100 football players because they're the ones that you easily have access to while doing your research for a college class, it's already biased. If that's not identified and if in the conclusion it's not stated, the population we used was somewhat specific in terms of a skill level or 10 or 20 years of doing a bench press, the research, the results might change if we have a bunch of 50-year-old, never worked out before people. Do you understand how important that is? And that one thing right there negates and potentially invalidates so much exercise research out there. Anyway, this is interesting. They come along and, oh, I need to talk about this. Here's the thing, not that can you see? Way back here, you know, the problem is I'm never going to find it because I can't see it. Oh, so they did some interesting things, and they seem to state their methods well. They seem to qualify their results based upon the specifics of the variables, etc. So what they come along, they never seem to state, unless I missed it, which is entirely possible, they never state if they're talking, they just says the forces. What they're measuring in this article are the forces of the person's effort, similar to, although that picture I just showed is unrelated, it's very similar in what they think they're measuring or what they're graphically illustrating in that first thing. But they go along and they talk about things like the magnitude of the lateral force averaged about 1/4 that of the vertical forces in a submaximal lift. So they're stating very clearly, and when you read an article like this, when they say in a submaximal lift, and if you don't state that when you're pretending to quote research, then you have misrepresented the research. This is so important. The internet's full with, well, the research says, no, this one study seems to indicate, but everything they say in here about who they used and what they did and the percentage of max and all that stuff is critical to this being remotely valid and critical to you stating it somewhat accurately. If we misrepresent what is supposedly valid research by saying the research says and you can't argue with the research, yeah, you can argue with the research all day long depending upon the variables they controlled, etc. And I can argue with you all day long if you don't state the entire facts of this. And if our attention span these days is too short, then shut up. Okay, anyway, here's an interesting thing to play with. Did you get all that? You know, like I say all the time, when I do social media stuff, this is not meant to be informative. This is not remotely education. Hopefully what I'm saying here inspires someone to go out and say, I do want to learn more about that so I don't appear to be like everybody else on social media. So let's take a look at this guy and this specific position in the bench press. We would have to put some kind of measurement device in order to measure the amount of push and the amount of forces either way, but realize in my mind, which is incredibly limited like everybody else's, if he is pushing a certain direction, can you see that okay? If he's pushing a certain direction and we happen to identify that there's a certain amount of lateral forces from this guy, do you know what is happening? Do you know what he's responding to? If he's pushing with a certain amount of force, that's because this thing, this device, this tool, demands a certain amount of force based on the overcoming of inertia and a lot of other factors besides this is another thing. This is what partially you should have questioned with this. Instead of running around saying, this research says, you should say, now realize if you change speeds, you change acceleration and deceleration, and you change the execution, one of the changes in execution might be acceleration or deceleration. That will change the forces because this resistance is not just a bar, it's restrained mass. Right? The vertical force is gravity, gravitational pull on mass. So what have we got? Well, if he's attempting to do this and attempting to do that, the real story here that I'm more concerned about, not that those aren't true, but that it's the resistance that to some degree is influencing that stuff. And if we were to extend a resultant down here, what we're going to end up with is some kind of relationship of resistance to potentially, if I could draw worth a crap, specific joints. So there are moment arms to the two joints. And the way I've drawn that right now, if that was remotely accurate, and I'm quite sure it's bad, but this would be twice as much resistance to the elbow musculature than to the shoulder if this was what was happening. These are just poor arrows drawn, and he's just got no weight on the bar, and he can probably lift 1,000 pounds. So, yeah, that's what would be happening, and there's no way around that. That's the beauty of a moment arm. It creates a measurable amount of torque if you know the force that's applied to that, which changes with inertial effects, etc., i.e. how you perform the exercise. So that's a really important thing, because then I start to recognize that his effort in these directions is determined by something other than just he's randomly shoving. Shoving against something has the requirements as influenced of the something. It's the something that creates those requirements. All you have to do is choose to move it or try to move it. So our effort is a response mentally to the fact that this weight is sitting there. Now, as soon as you try to push on it, it's an immediate non-reaction, it's immediate force. And it's so funny that people don't go, while we put our foot on the ground and they go, ground reaction forces. Why don't they say bar reaction forces? Because we always were so egocentric as humans. It's like, well, we created these forces. No, the bar started. Your attempt at moving it demanded an immediate creation of this relationship. But make no mistake, these forces and your resultant of effort shove and these forces and your resultant of resistance will be equal in each direction, assuming you can move the thing, right? If you can't move it, this arrow is going to be much bigger than your effort arrow. So remember, while opposite, they're not equal. If they were equal, you would be holding it still. If somebody won the tug of war, it'd be going up or the weight would be going down. Okay? Net forces, not just the simple equation for force. Pretty nice, round, that's a good shaped head. I don't think if I shaved my head, I'd have like bumps and scars and, oh yeah, we're not talking about that. So the thing I want to bring up here is a couple things. Number one, this is likely to change throughout the range. So historically, when I first recognized this 25 years ago, and I started going, oh wow, there's a resultant. Yeah, got to have a moment of awareness at some point. I would draw this or try to show it in a live class and thought that was enough. In the end, it's not enough. It is extremely likely, with other influences, that when this person gets to the top, here I'll do this so I don't screw it up too severely. Now we'll never know the numbers right here. In this just example, we'll never know the proportions because I haven't measured vertical forces, gravitational forces versus frictional forces, which is really what we're talking about. But somewhere in here is a resultant that might very likely go through, well, you just didn't want to, that might, if extended down, might be almost balanced through his arm at the top, almost. So this amount of frictional force, while the vertical ones are unlikely to change barring inertial effects, acceleration, deceleration, this is likely to change as we get to the top and the bottom. In fact, I'm betting if I went back to this, it is possible, depending upon how much vertical challenge there is, it is possible that if he could choose through intention to push straight up, this would be his best chance because his forearm is almost vertical. If it's not, I'm going to keep saying this, if it's not a 1 rep max or something close to that, or a final rep of 8 where the final one is 8 rep max, it is entirely possible he could almost eliminate his outward need for an outward shove and almost eliminate the frictional component. He could virtually shove straight up. And while I didn't recognize this when we were playing around with it and trying to measure these things, it became obvious that people could choose to do that. And almost innately, it happens right here, almost. This is one factor that's going to come into play. If you've got something that's far removed from a max rep or a max lift, you have choices, at least until you don't. Meaning when you have to do one thing to accomplish it. So right there is going to be one of the factors. How challenging is the lift? That's going to determine what may or may not happen. So research, there's too many variables. There's too many variables to choose a max lift, submax lift of 50%, submax lift of 25%, submax lift of 80% less than max, right? I'm talking about less than, not necessarily of. But these things will change. So can we say this is always the way it's going to be? We cannot. But in this scenario, if you put something that would slide on this bar, it is unlikely that he could keep an arm at this direction on the bar from sliding outward. It would take a lot of work to prevent that, which means he's fighting specific forces. So anyway, his arm wants to slide out. Got it? Is there any friction? If not, it's going to change what's happening. What about in the middle? Well, if it changes at the top and the bottom, it would be reasonable, although I haven't measured it, it would be reasonable, depending upon the percentage of abilities, challenges, that this would be yet different from the other two. And there's not just two and there's not just three. Historically, we look at the top and the bottom of a lift. Everything in between is likely to change to some degree also. I've only seen this applied to a bench press. But that makes sense because every one of the guys that's concerned about this or interested in this was asked when they were 15, how much do you bench press? Nobody ever said, hey, Joe, how much do you pull down? Right? So, but here we got restraint between the hands again. Everything's going to be opposite. Meaning at the bottom here, I'm going to draw on my TV, good Lord. So he's pulling down. Can you see that? He's pulling down and likely, some degree, pulling in. The bar is keeping his hands from coming in. There's your friction or whatever. Happens, might be a little something else because of the angle of the bar. And so there's the resistance. The actual resistance, you're going, the resistance is the cable. No, that's the vertical component. What is happening on the bar, either via intention or necessity, depending upon the load, is creating a moment arm, or I should say, a resultant to each joint. Now, if you want to always draw creating a moment arm, did I say that right, to each joint? I'm trying to do this too fast. If you're always drawing your moment arms through the bone, which I've had a lot of students do, that's incorrect also. So you can't do any of this without a solid definition of a moment arm. And by the way, the guy out there that used to be one of my students who's trying to be a presenter now, when you say a moment arm is the shortest perpendicular distance from the line of force to the joint, there's no such thing as a long perpendicular distance from a line of force to a joint. It is perpendicular that makes it the shortest. Those things coincide. It doesn't make it the shortest, that's where it is. So if you're going to become the teacher of trainers, you better get the definition of a moment arm down, dude. Whew, that's scary shit. So at the top, yeah, it's liable to be something different. Here's the cable component pulling up. Here's whatever's happening in terms of friction or whatever at the bar. Here's resistance. Extend the resistance down. Remember, a line of force could be extended forever to see its influence on these respective joints, not just the shoulder. And yes, somewhere in between is likely to be different. Now, the interesting thing about this, as well as the bench press, on a maximal lift, maximal is not just the most weight you can lift. It's the ideal moment arms at each position in order to lift that weight, because resistance is not weight. Resistance is torque. Weight is 50% of the equation. If we can't get that through our heads, we have no business trying to be exercise professionals. Does the average person running around doing bench presses need to know this? Absolutely not. Who could possibly care? Okay? But this is important to recognize, very important to recognize, that ultimately resistance is torque. That is the reason that all this matters. And if you're going to find the torque at each joint, you have to have the resultant. The cable, the weight, meaning gravity, the dumbbell. Those are all a little bit different. The cable is only what you're pulling against if you're pulling with one hand with one handle. The dumbbell, it's gravity. Its only influence is gravity and inertia in any given direction of acceleration, because it's not restraining you. A bar is different depending upon the direction you're shoving relative to the plane of the bar. So you can't even necessarily take a close grip bench press and say that all these things are exactly true, unless it happens to be in a Smith machine. And if you're going, Tom, this is too fast, I'm not trying to teach you. I'm trying to get you to recognize the excessive number of variables and possibilities. And when you see one thing on the internet with one person saying, look, here's the forces, here's what's happening, I need that person, if they're going to be respected at all, if they're throwing it out there, someone needs to be saying, give us a specific context, give us a specific person, are you at least saying submax? Are you at least saying, because it all changes. It all changes. So that's why we've done this little thing in the end as just a representation, not meant to be accurate. This is from one of my class course thingies. And the considerations. Are we looking at effort forces? Are we looking at resistance forces? They influence each other. They, in essence, are the same, only opposite, right? And if you want to figure out what's happening in each joint, it makes more sense to identify the resistance resultant, because then you can actually at least ballpark the relationship of forces at that joint. This is more than this. You don't have to go, this is 5 centimeters and this is 10 centimeters. Forget that. You don't even, where the axis position is not even that accurate from the eyeball. What you choose to do, some people say, well, I shove in on the bar and I feel more chest. That's because you changed the direction of friction. So you've changed the direction of resistance by shoving in. You've changed that resultant. I don't expect you to see that right now, but I expect you to appreciate that it's something valuable to learn if we're going to play the, hey, I'm on social media and I'm an expert game. If we're going to play that, we need to be able to show these things, know these things. But you don't get to do the intentioned thing except I'm just shoving if you have a max, be it the last rep of an 8-rep max, be it the one and only rep of a 1-rep max. You don't get to choose those things necessarily. However, skill level we're going to find is going to affect this. So there's the percentage of rep max, and I put that in quotation marks because you don't need to do a 1-rep max and take a percentage and assume that there's a certain relationship of horizontal and vertical forces there. Let's just keep it. If we're going to oversimplify anything, we need to say the further you get from a max challenge, the more likely you are to be able to generate intention, because as you change a moment arm, if the moment arm at a joint gets bigger, and you were already maxed out in terms of torque generating capability at that joint, you can't make that moment arm longer because you're creating more resistance even if you haven't changed the number on the bar. This is the way we need to be able to talk about this stuff. We need a language. We're going to play the game. Everybody wants to analyze exercise and they want to be the man on the internet. If they can't speak the language, we've got a problem. If we want to watch people do this, we have to understand the language. Skill is a big component in this. It is very likely that you take some unskilled lifters. They are not shoving in any, they're all over the map. You've seen them, they're all over the bench and everything else. The more skilled someone is, the more exacting and purposeful and ideal their direction of shove is, in concert with the direction of resistance that's being both created vertically and generated to some degree by the skill level laterally. There's less waste, more efficient, effort-oriented force, creating the ideal moment arms for that max lift. It changes with concentric and eccentric. While most of these things are measured statically, which is brilliant, that in no way represents what's happening when someone's moving the bar or the bar's moving them, right? Because the need changes. Inertial effects will alter it. So these things are really interesting. So who cares? Well, depending on who I'm working with, I don't. I love it, but I don't necessarily care all the time. And I love talking about it. I like to nerd out with people who like this stuff too. But we always have to put in context. Just because you know a lot of cool textbook stuff doesn't mean you're any good as an exercise professional. That's one piece of the puzzle. And you have to recognize when the person's tolerance and skill level, and you progressing their skill level, and you understanding that not everybody's a power lifter, that's probably the single most prioritized, triaged, most important piece of knowledge, if you will, for an exercise professional.